If you look at the ban list, you might notice there are a few cards on there that probably don't need to be on it anymore. Cards like TRIBE-INFECTING virus were once very powerful and very popular, but these days, even if TRIBE-INFECTING virus came back to 3 copies per deck, I can't really think of a ton of strategies that would play it. Obviously, things like Mermail Atlanteans would probably side deck it as a board wipe that triggers their effects, but in general, if TRIBE-INFECTING virus came back to 3 copies per deck, most people wouldn't really notice, and it probably wouldn't find its way into many competitive decks. In today's video though, we are not focusing on cards like that aren't very good anymore. We're focusing on cards that, looking back, I can't really even understand why Konami made them exist in the first place. All the cards on this list are on this list because of poor planning and not being future-proofed. It seemed like when Konami made many of these cards, they weren't really thinking of how they would be used in tournaments or how they'd be used years later. Obviously, some of these cards are going to be older, so Konami couldn't possibly predict how the game would look 10, 15 years later. But in today's video, I want to go over some cards that I think when you look at them nowadays, it's like, why did Konami make those in the first place? Starting off with number 5, Card of Safe Return. Now, Card of Safe Return is a very powerful continuous spell card that says each time a monster is special summoned from your graveyard, draw 1 card. Now, this is not once per turn. This was way before soft once per turns and hard once per turns, and what makes this card so deadly isn't necessarily just activating 1 Card of Safe Return. It's when you have multiples on the field, because this card for a very long time was legal at 3 copies per deck, and not many people played it, because if you think back to old school Yu-Gi-Oh, yes, there certainly was ways to bring back cards from your graveyard. Things like Premature Burial, Monster Reborn, and Call the Haunted were all very popular, but Card of Safe Return is meant to be played in a deck that can abuse it over and over and over again, and it wasn't until Zombie Master came out that people really started experimenting with this card at a competitive level. It's pretty silly when Zombie Master discards a card, special summons a card, and then you instantly get a draw, especially in a 2007 format, and that is a big deal as well because you are drawing multiple cards with Card of Safe Return every single turn. Zombie Master can bring Zombie Master back, so you can just discard a whole bunch of Zombie Masters, special summon a whole bunch of Zombie Masters, and then draw more cards in the process. What makes Card of Safe Return especially cool in that strategy is that the first Card of Safe Return oftentimes would draw into extra copies of the card, and now with Zombie Master, you're discarding 1 card to get a free special summon and a 2-card draw. That is way too good even for old school Yu-Gi-Oh! You just could outvalue every single opponent that you played. What was even crazier is that those zombie decks had plenty of ways to stall until they drew that setup. They had cards like Pyramid Turtle and Giant Rat, and more importantly, they had things besides Zombie Master that could trigger Card of Safe Return. Things like Ill Blood and Book of Life were very commonly played in those decks alongside the Zombie Master, so even if you didn't draw your main combo pieces, you could dig towards them using Card of Safe Return, and then you eventually got to that big combo where you were drawing a ton of cards from your deck and just killing every opponent that you face. Obviously, Card of Safe Return was designed in a time and format when people weren't really playing a ton of abusable and reusable graveyard recursion, but it really can never come back to Yu-Gi-Oh! It's a card that is simply way too powerful to ever come back in any capacity to 2019 or even future Yu-Gi-Oh! Pretty much every single deck, even the meta decks, even the rogue decks, even the bad decks, have some form of graveyard recursion in 2019. That is simply another aspect of Yu-Gi-Oh! That was added on somewhere in the last 15 years. Every single deck is going to have some way to get their cards back, and if you don't, the deck is probably so unplayable that it doesn't really matter anyway. But for the most part, Card of Safe Return, being a non-once per turn effect, is simply too abusable, even if it's at just 1 copy per deck. As long as your deck has many graveyard recursion effects, you can take advantage of it over and over and over again in a single turn. It's just way too good to ever be in this game. Invasion of Chaos was one of the most pivotal moments for Yu-Gi-Oh! Releasing tons of cards that would make the game go from old school Yu-Gi-Oh! To sort of new school Yu-Gi-Oh! Things like Blackluster Soldier simply were way more powerful than anything released prior to them, and one of the cards that was released in this set was Dimension Fusion, a card that is absolutely ridiculous. I can't even believe this was ever printed. So this card says pay 2,000 life points, both players special summon as many of their monsters as possible that have been removed from play. Oh my god, Konami, what were you thinking? I mean, don't get me wrong, this card was not immediately overpowered. Not every single deck played it. If you look at things like GOAT format, people aren't really experimenting with Dimension Fusion too much. It simply was not consistent enough, even with all the banishing support in Invasion of Chaos, to actually be a viable card. It wouldn't be until a few years later when people started abusing this card with Strike Ninja and Diamond Dude Turbo, and then eventually what led this card to getting banned was Darkham Dragon Return. This card is so ridiculous. I think I can see what Konami was trying trying to do. They were like, oh, the downside is that your opponent gets all of their banished cards too. So if you're both playing banished card decks, then they get all of theirs and you get all of yours. Perfectly balanced. The problem with this card is that Konami did not foresee people using it on the very first turn before your opponent even gets a chance to play a card or play any banished cards at all. You can just Dimension Fusion and bring back all of your cards, and your opponent never gets a chance to bring back theirs, and then you just set up an unbreakable board, at least by like 2007 standards, and your opponent simply can't deal with all of your cards. Very shortly after this card was released in the same year, we have Return from a Different Dimension, and that more seems like what Konami would try to do to push banish support. It has a lot more restrictions, it's a trap card, and yet that card obviously ended up being too good as well. But it's crazy to think about that Konami released two very similar cards back to back, and yet one of them, Dimension Fusion, is so much better than the other one. Obviously Konami did want to try to balance a card like Dimension Fusion, and that's why they released Return from a Different Dimension, but still, both cards are too strong. Obviously though, Dimension Fusion is much more powerful. This card is crazy. It obviously can't come back ever again. Let's completely ignore the fact that it's not once per turn. Even if this card was like once per duel, it'd be way too strong. We saw a traditional tournament played, and one of the funniest things that happened was someone used Ronin Totem like 50 times in a turn, and then used Dimension Fusion to bring back all of their banished frogs and make a field of Saryuja Skulldread and 3 totally awesome. Hilariously, that field got sphere moded, but that's obviously not something that you want to have to play. You shouldn't have to play sphere mode in your main deck just to combat your opponent using Dimension Fusion and making a board of like a million negates. Dimension Fusion, way too good, obviously will never come back, but it's pretty funny to think about that Konami thought that banishing needed a card like this to be competitively viable. Painful Choice will forever be known as one of the worst designed and overpowered cards in all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and yeah, I'm not going to be too hard on Konami for making this card exist in the first place. The reason I'm not going to be too hard on them is because this was released in Magic Ruler, which is one of the very first sets in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. It's pretty obvious that Konami didn't know what they were doing back then. Obviously, you have this weird juxtaposition between terrible main deck monsters that like aren't very good next to these really powerful spell cards like Painful Choice, Delinquent Duo, Snatch Steal. Yu-Gi-Oh was like so spell focused at this time, no thanks to cards like Painful Choice. This card is ridiculous. It was ridiculous back then. It would be crazy now. In 2019, I can't imagine a card as good as Painful Choice. It's a card that loads up your graveyard with a ton of trigger effects. It's a card that adds any card to your hand. It is just crazy how overpowered this card. This will never ever come back. It would need so many restrictions to be good. When we think of a situation where Upstart Goblin is so good that it has to get limited, obviously Painful Choice, which is like Upstart Goblin, except you get to select one of the cards that goes to your hand, or at least you get to narrow it down to 5 cards that you always get and you pick graveyard effects. Obviously that's going to be way too good. I can't believe this card ever existed. It's so overpowered. Even as like an old school card, this seems way too good for it to ever be printed. I just can't believe that Konami actually put this card in the game. If I look at like newer card games, if they ever had a card like Painful Choice, I'd be like, wow, they don't know how to balance anything. Of course, 2002 was a different time, so I can't be too hard on them. But Painful Choice, obviously overpowered, obviously will never come back. It's just way too good. Next up, I can't believe that Self-Destruct button used to be a card that existed. This card promotes so many bad things in a Yu-Gi-Oh tournament experience, and it's funny too because Konami actually made it so many old school cards like Ring of Destruction that used to cause a lot of matches to end in a draw, they actually eroded those cards and changed the ruling so that one player always has to win. It doesn't just end up in a draw every time. In the case of Ring of Destruction, you take the damage first, and then if you lose, your opponent no longer takes the rest of that damage. It's a very unique ruling that really is only specific to cards that burn both players. Konami really doesn't want draws to happen in tournaments, and that's why it's so weird that Konami printed Self-Destruct button. It's a card that only ever saw play in degenerate decks like Chain Burn or Final Countdown, and really promotes slow play as well, because you could slow play through all of game 1, get the game for yourself so you win. You're up 1 game, and then you just flip Self-Destruct button after stalling out in game 2, and now seeing you have a win and your opponent doesn't have a win, you win the match. This card is terribly designed, and I can't believe Konami ever printed it. Konami hates drawing in tournaments. They hate it so much, and it causes so many issues between players. It's just so crazy that they printed a card that actively encourages degeneracy and stalling, and it's just really weird, and we probably will never see a card like this again. And lastly, I not only cannot believe that Konami invented Chicken Game at all, but I especially can't believe that they made it a field spell, because Chicken Game on paper is a really cool idea. I think Konami had sort of the same headspace when they made Dimension Fusion as they did with Chicken Game. In the case of Dimension Fusion, they were thinking, well, this card can't be overpowered because your opponent gets to bring back all of their monsters as well, but they weren't really thinking of the applications when you just activate it on the first turn. In the same vein, I think that Chicken Game suffered the similar design philosophy of, oh, this is a really cool idea, your opponent gets a chance to use it or blow it up, it's sort of a chicken game. I really like the lore behind this card. The problem is that it's a field spell, and it means that you can basically play a 30 card deck when this card was revealed. The reason being is that with Chicken Game, you can search it with Terraforming, so now you have a 6 card or 6 cards that are all Chicken Game, and then you can play 3 copies of Pseudospace, so now you have 9 copies that are all just blank cards in your deck, and then you can add that 1 copy of Upstart Goblin because it was limited when Chicken Game came out on the TCG, and now whatever deck you're playing can only be 30 cards because you have 10 blank spots. That just shouldn't be around. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is not meant to be played with 30 cards. It gives so many other degenerate strategies a boost in consistency that just shouldn't be there. Chicken Game is just one of the worst designed cards, and it's really crazy because it's one of the only cards on this list that was released and designed in a modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Era. You'd think by this point Konami would know that they should make cards like this hard once per turn or give them some greater form of restriction. Maybe you can't special summon the turn you use Chicken Game. Maybe you can't draw other cards the turn you use Chicken Game. I'm not sure, but as it stands, Chicken Game is so poorly designed, I don't think it'll ever come back into the TCG, especially with cards like Terraforming and Pseudospace existing. Chicken Game might have been balanced if it wasn't a field spell, but as it stands as a field spell and not a continuous spell or a continuous trap card, Chicken Game's design is basically unsalvageable. Anyway though, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on 5 banned cards that I couldn't believe existed. If you have any other banned cards that you don't think should have existed or that you can't believe existed, please put them in the comment section below. I think it'd be cool to have a discussion going about which other cards on the ban list just are so poorly designed, so non-future proof. I'd really love to see what you guys have as far as feedback for those cards. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.